Journalism today is in a state of flux. In the past, most people received their news from nightly broadcasts and daily papers. Today, more and more people are getting their news from alternative sources online, making it difficult to keep the official narrative afloat. I sat down with members of Project Censored to discuss the state of journalism today and where it needs to head in the near future.
Well, when Project Censored started 36 years ago, there were, at that time, 50 major media corporations in the country. And over that period of time, we're now down to less than 10. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing with this consolidation of media is not only a loss of diversity of news sources, but a loss of diversity in terms of stories. And so that if you're watching MSNBC or CNN, essentially you have the same coverage, same issues, sometimes the same pictures, and it's within a framework of what is Washington saying, what are the professionals saying, what is the experts saying, and so there's very little left in terms of minority points of view and diversity.
And as Peter said, in the 1980s there were about 50 corporations that controlled the media in the United States. Now we're down to fewer than 10, half a dozen major firms, companies, conglomerates. Conglomeration is continuing. We still have the Time Warner, Disney, GE. We still have the military-industrial complex owning, right? The tie-in, the combination of cross boards of directorships of major corporations and banks with media ownership, and with that, then the particularly the selection of news stories and then the editorial elements of those news outlets tend to favor the major companies, corporate America, banks, etc., and they really don't tend toward a free press model. In other words, they don't just go out and report things for the public to consume. Peter and I have referred to this as managed news, where they're really selecting certain types of things to hear that ultimately frame debates in such a way that even if people are led to believe they have a choice in certain issues, both sides of the issue, right, this kind of a thing. Yeah. There's a lot of things that are left outside the frame so that people are led to believe they're choosing something, when in fact they're ultimately choosing something that benefits the main stockholders and the corporations that are controlling the information.
Absolutely.
Really only have about 120 individuals that are managing these major media firms in the country. They're on the board of directors.
Yeah.
And they are in turn on the board of directors of 20% of the corporate 1,000. So they're on the big banks, they're on the military firms, they're on major industrial firms. So their point of view is pro-capital, positive in terms of America as being the best and global dominance, so we're going to proceed and save the world, build democracy. Yeah. Those kinds of orientations set the tone and the culture for how the news is covered.
Interestingly, when you talked about media, or what people conceptualize generally when they hear media in the United States is what's strangely referred to as the mainstream media. We don't use that term. We call it the corporate media because that's what it is. Calling it the mainstream media is a very effective propagandistic adoption by assuming that it's speaking for everybody and it gives both sides of a story. And that's really brilliant as far as a co-opted type of methodology to try to control debate. But the reality is it's corporate media. And the interesting thing that Pew Research did again recently was when they surveyed the people across the country, they found out that over 75% of the population don't trust corporate media. Yet the irony is that 80-odd% of them still get their information from those sources. So there is a disconnect. And it also shows that people really do want to have news rather than junk food news, which we've covered at Project Censored for years, or news abuse. People, even if they are interested for whatever reason in keeping up with the Kardashians, they're also interested in what's really going on in the seats of power. And people do seem to have a general sense that things are going awry. And they are curious as to why. They are trained, however, historically through our educational institutions to look to these two-party apparatus type things. Like, well, if this party's not working, we've got to go back to this party. Well, 8 years of this party isn't working, we better go back to this party.
Exactly.
And in the mix, what gets lost are actually the values and the viewpoints and the interests of we the people. And so that's something I think that also gets really left out. And one thing the corporate media do very well never to cover is themselves.
Yeah.
The analysis of themselves, the ownership material of themselves, their symbiotic relationship with advertisers, cross boards of directorates, stockholders, etc. And so that really keeps a lot of people in the dark about the actual day-to-day operations of news as a business. It's also the case, too, that many of the social movements that have looked for change have been co-opted by the establishment such that changes needed to take place within the system.
Yeah.
And I think more and more, we say this in media, and we're also saying it here now in government, in elections, and so on. It's not reformation, it's reclamation. It's reclaiming the original principles of liberty, of democracy, of participatory government, a media that is based on actual free press principles. And there are many organizations that are out there doing independent journalism, hard-hitting journalism. And the internet has been a great place for that. But of course, as you see, through government and lobbyists, many of the major media corporations are trying to shut it down, whether it's PIPA or SOPA or CISPA or whatever, ACTA, all the acronyms of Orwellian acronyms, basically saying, well, we're here to protect people's rights and we're here to protect private property and these kind of things. But I mean, that's going to destroy the diversity. That's going to destroy that ability for somebody to really get views out that are unpopular, right? And are not really working toward the establishment in terms of the overall policy agendas. And reclamation means, too, taking back these kinds of terms. Particularly now it's an election year in America, so many of the somnambulist citizens are somehow now sort of half awake talking about, well, it's Romney, no, it's Obama. Again, it's this false paradigm, right? And how do we get these people to understand? Well, one way you get them to understand is by going where they already know there's a problem, right? And many people know economically there are problems. And as Peter said, we should focus less on these wedge issues, abortion, gay marriage, right? And we just saw a couple weeks back, Obama comes out and says, well, I think gays should have the right to marry, and that's my personal view, but it should be left up for the states to decide. And he's on the cover of Time magazine, and he's riding unicorns with rainbows, and he's the gayest president in history. Except that it's exactly the same thing Dick Cheney said in 2004. And nobody's going to accuse him of being the gayest vice president in history.
That's very true.
So it's how it's framed, right? And the corporate media is framing it as a wedge issue. We have a corporate media structure that acts in much more capacity to keep things disconnected, to never remember the past. It really fosters a sense of historical amnesia, right? You're never supposed to think analogously about the past and the present because you might come to it with a sense of realization. So when we see something happening like at WMD, most of us are culturally illiterate to the point to where we don't say Gulf of Tonkin, or USS Maine, or whatever, And again, these narratives are there, but we would hope that a media would help bring those to people's attention, not to propagandistically create obedient shoppers of political parties or toothpaste.
What are your thoughts on some of the essentially fake newscasts done? Do you think that happens more often than people are aware of? And what does that mean? We spoke earlier of news not being given to us. What is this about essentially fake news being thrown at us?
This is the epitome of managed news and produced news. That's all part of a reality media landscape, right? Sort of the reality television programming, et cetera, et cetera. We're here live, except we're not. And that's, by the way, it's escalated in terms of the reality of it to now we're in the stage of literally news media generated events that are actual events. They are actually happening, but they are also simultaneously being orchestrated literally for a news media audience. And the most blatant example of that comes to mind is the toppling of the Saddam Hussein statue after the second bombing and invasion and then occupation of Iraq in 2003, where many of the people that were bussed in from Iran and other parts of the place that were behind Ahmed Chalabi, who was a CIA asset that was being paid and groomed to eventually maybe take over Iraq, but then wasn't. This event was literally staged, right, to look like the Iraqis were exuberant and in jubilee about the fall of Saddam Hussein, which I guess I would imagine many were, right? So it's interesting even to that degree of like, so you guys couldn't find enough jubilant Iraqis to come out and like cheer this thing on, that they had to bust 300 or 400 people in to make it happen, and they then show it, and they show the American soldier going up and draping the American flag over, and then of course it's like no. That's the managed news part that's not working. Don't do that. We're not occupiers. We're liberators. And you might remember that the first initial slogan for the American occupation there and bombing and so on was Operation Iraqi Liberation, which unfortunately spells OIL. So, really quickly, like, wait a minute, OIF, Operation Iraqi Freedom, OIF, that's not oil. We don't want to connect that too much, even though that's how the modern state of Iraq begins after World War I with the British and American petroleum companies, historical amnesia. But anyway, that's a manufactured event, and when you see the video and the photos of the event, you can see that most of the people are just sort of hovering around it, and then the rest of the square is empty. Right? I mean, so it's literally it's a real event. It really does happen. The statue does get toppled, but not by whom we think, and not for the purposes that are projected. So it is a hyper-real exercise. Jean Baudrillard years ago actually talked about the first Gulf War and talked about hyper-reality. And he used the example of Disneyland. Sort of like you're there, it's real, but when you're really there, it's not real. Disney is not real. Everything in Disneyland is sort of a facsimile, right? Really, our news coverage is more and more this way. But that shouldn't come as a shock to people that were media scholars, because historian Daniel Borston wrote, in 1962, he wrote a book called The Image, A Guide to Pseudo-Events in American History. And he talked about the press conference as sort of the then modern day equivalent of like sort of the ongoing, the perfect image, the perfect pseudo-event is the press conference, right? And in this case, it goes forward where you could say presidential debates, like staged, mock, made to look real. And they are real, but they're also really manufactured, manipulated, staged. In many cases, like this event in Iraq with the statue. The Jessica Lynch story, another example of this. So, unfortunately, one of the problems about these is many people don't know about them, and I'm sure there are many stories that we probably don't know about because we didn't find out. But the fact that there is such a great effort, an elaborate ruse to erect these faux spectacles and co-opt real or legitimate sentiments in the population, that says something about these media institutions that one would think would be damning enough that it would draw immense suspicion, and one would think it would call for inquiry. Well, some type of admonition, some type of punishment, some type of justice. I mean, it is legal for the media to lie, right? Despite the 1934 Telecommunications Act, after the Fox News case and with Monsanto over RGBH, over the recombinant bovine growth hormone issue, where the story was spiked about how it had health risks and so forth, the journalists that were told that they weren't allowed to report the story and would be paid to not report it, they lost their jobs from Fox News. The owner of Fox News in Tampa, Florida said, "We paid $3 billion for these news stations. We'll tell you what the news is." They win the original count on whistleblower cause for being forced to lie, right, about this, and then it's reversed on appeal, because it goes back to, technically this is privately owned, leasing the public airwaves, and they're allowed to report or not report something on the basis of whether or not it would negatively impact their shareholders. And all of the other major corporate media filed an amicus of the court brief, friend of the court, on behalf of Fox, saying, well, yeah, we kind of like that too. That would be cool if we could do it too. And essentially, the outcome of that means that they can legally lie, and not necessarily be held accountable for it. So this type of chicanery and this type of facade that really masquerades as news is, I'm afraid, far more prevalent than many people are aware and would like to admit.
What role did Edward Bernays and his theses, especially those espoused in his book Propaganda, what kind of role has he played on American society?
Bernays is arguably one of the most influential figures of the 20th century in terms of information dissemination. He's the nephew of Sigmund Freud that used some of his uncle's ideas about manipulating sort of through communication and these things. He was also involved with the Committee on Public Information in World War I, the first official governmental propaganda agency to whip up support for World War I against the Germans. And a Creel Commission, it was also called, named after George Creel, an advertising guy that ran it. But they whipped up these propaganda campaigns to influence public opinion. And lo and behold, they saw that it worked, that they could manipulate public opinion by appealing to certain sentiments and telling half-truths. Yeah. And so this was really kind of the birthplace of modern propaganda as a science of information. Yeah. And it was also seen as the way of running, operating a modern democratic state. Edward Bernays argued that this, in fact, was the way that a modern democratic society ought to run, through manipulation of public opinion. And he believed later, of course in 1928, he literally wrote a book called Propaganda, and he talked about the efficacy of information control. And he talked about, again, how, look, there's a great quote we've had in many of our books about this that basically suggests that it is the unseen mechanism of our society that's the true government. It's the manipulators of the message behind the scenes. And Bernays, in real Hamiltonian fashion, argued that ought to be the way. Yeah. And he and Lippmann and others at the time, Walter Lippmann, said, well, the bewildered herd, the public, they don't necessarily know what's best for them, so they need to be guided by the intellectuals, by the smart guys, right? Whether it be the Wilsonian Democrats or, fill in the blanks. At that time, that's who it was. Yeah. Later, Bernays lived he lived to be 102. Wow. And he was the main guy behind sort of the Guatemala coup, the Banana Republic. He was also in 1947, he wrote a work called Engineering Consent that later people like Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman wrote about these terms. They didn't invent manufacturing consent or engineering consent. They got them from Bernays, because Bernays said this is the root of modern democratic theory, engineering populist sentiment. So it's created by controlling information. Well, that's antithetical to a free press principle, isn't it? Absolutely. Because it doesn't report what's really going on for people to decide, as George Seldes suggested in the mid-20th century. It's let's just tell the people what we need them to know so that it looks like, so we maintain the illusion of democratic participation. Yeah. And unfortunately, I think, for small d democratic values, Bernays has really sort of tilted that on its ear. And it has become the mainstay of contemporary American political culture and the news media. We live in an age of sound bites. We live in an age where elections and major decisions are made very little in terms of substance. Things like style and playing to wedge issues and so on, these are all stand-ins for real debates. Yeah. And I think that the reason you see such high percentages of people that are saying they don't trust corporate media anymore is there is this disaffection, and people really are feeling, I would say, anemic in terms of having access to real, actual information. And even though we have the internet, one of the questions we get asked most often at Project Censored is, where do you get information? The problem is that in American society, the society of immediate gratification, many people want to say, like, well, truth.com, where do I go? Where do I push the button on the remote to go to get it to me? Yeah. And it's like, I've been doing this for over 20 years. I've been looking at hundreds of media resources and independent journalists and so on, and I mean for a couple decades. Yeah. And I feel like I'm scratching the surface of it. Yeah. It's a process. The truth is a process whereby we try to validate information, verify information, right? It's not meant to be a bludgeon. It's not meant to beat people with in terms of our own belief system. It ought to be, under free press principles, a means by which we are able to get information out to people, ascertain what the facts really are, and then act intelligently on the basis of what they say about where we're going as a society.
Do you think that the hyper-partisanship that has occurred has happened because of this?
I think the role that media play exacerbates the tendency. As Marshall McLuhan suggested, the Canadian scholar in the 60s, the medium is the message. And we see that in the early Kennedy-Nixon presidential debates. And this is, I mentioned Daniel Boorstin in the Image work before. Yeah. Again, it's style over substance. And major political players know that when the camera's rolling, they're on. Yeah. Right? And we've all heard the axiom, no publicity is bad publicity. Yeah. Right? Meaning that, hey, no matter why I'm getting attention, it's going to put my whatever I'm about into the public consciousness, right? Over and over and over again. And of course, that can backfire. But it's really played. That's really played upon. And specifically, it takes time to develop cogent arguments. It takes time in order for people to say things that are out of the ordinary, beyond the conventional wisdom. It takes time for people to factually argue things that folks may not have considered before. Well, our news media is about concision. It's about sound bites. So the only thing you really have time for are mouthing platitudes or repeating the status quo. So when you get somebody that does have a different way of thinking about things or wants to expose significant problems, not just to be negative, but to also use it as a platform for talking about where could we be going, where are the solutions, what could we be doing collectively to change the way this is operating. Well, we never get there because cut the commercial. Or I have my 2 minutes, now you have your 2 minutes, right? And so if I want to sneak myself into there in any real way, I have to be relegated to bullet points. And look, you can't really say more controversial or deeply historically rooted types of comments in the realm of concision, right? And so I think, again, that the way that media has exacerbated these polarities is because that's what we're relegated to. You know, Warhol talked about 15 minutes, right? We're down to 15 seconds, okay? And people know that. So they're going to pander to it. So what you have is this cycle. The inertia is going to that level of speed up, which is inevitably going away from sober dialogue and discourse. Even just in the last 2 decades, I have seen a real change in our culture in the ability of people to be able to listen for sustained periods of time in a way that they don't lose their train of thought. And I think that has been exacerbated by media coverage, by flash imagery, by quickness, sociological speed up, and by artificial intelligence. You know, and I know that we're not getting into that here and the impact that it's had on the brain, but you know, recent scientific studies have shown that a lot of this reliance on these kinds of technological information apparati or devices and so forth has had a scattering effect on our thought process. Multitasking has had a negative impact on our ability as human beings to focus in depth on things. And I think that's an emerging crisis that we will see in the next generation, the results. And I'm afraid that they don't look pretty at this juncture.
What do you think the future of honest journalism is?
Well, corporate media is not in the business of information dissemination. They're in the business of propaganda, managed news, and control, and selling eyeballs to advertisers. And they do great at that. Infotainment is what they're about. We, the people, need to have our own journalism, our own free press, and our own means of communicating to each other, and we need to develop our own relationships and own trust with each other. We need to have FaceTime with each other. We need to sit down with people. I mean, even if that does technologically mean sort of that we're in communities where we're at least talking to each other. Not at each other. And one of the problems with some of the technological communication devices that we have now on internet and Facebook chats and these kind of things, people feel a sense of empowerment through anonymity, which could be a good thing, but it's also a bad thing insofar as it enables people to say outlandish things without any evidence or without any credibility attached to it. And it enables people to operate in ways that are irresponsible communicators. But what we could do with that same technology is encourage open, transparent dialogue and discourse, sharing information, sharing factual reports, talking about, well, you know, on one level, let's say we have this one story about Libya or this one story about the recent massacre in Syria, about how rebel forces were killing, civilians that, may have been Assad supporters, but weren't really part of what was going on. How is reporting that undermining a democracy movement? I mean, shouldn't that be part of the dialogue? Shouldn't that be reported as part of the discourse? Shouldn't that happen? And shouldn't we report what's going on and let the chips fall where they may? And technology can be helpful at allowing us to do that. But I think we also need to really get back to being a more critical thinking based society. And I say that based on thinkers like John Dewey at the turn of the 20th century. They wanted to turn the school into a laboratory for solving social problems. And I understand that also can be seen as a method of control, right? The idea that this is now going to be indoctrinated, right? And I understand that, and that's a real fear that people should have. But we should never really operate as people in a purportedly free society on the basis of what we are fearful about. You know, even Franklin Roosevelt warned people, you know, about fear. Remember, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And he talked about the 4 freedoms. And one of the things he talked about is the 4 freedoms, other than speech and the right to beliefs and expression and so forth, was the freedom from fear and want. And, you know, that's so important. That's such an important message. And again, I'm not saying Roosevelt is some savior, and he didn't live up to these principles either. But the point is that, wow, isn't that an historical kind of thing through the commons of our culture that we in the present could glom onto and say, wow, the power of that statement of what if we focused and built a society on the basis of these freedoms? And what if we not only wanted them for ourselves, but for everybody else? And I think that by being a self-motivated and generated type of you know, we the people, citizen journalists, not to say that professional journalists don't have a role, but I think that when we outsource any of this type of thing, we are somehow limiting our own agency and responsibility. And the ultimate role that a citizen can play in a free society is really being a responsible actor and an informed one in what's going on in the society. So I think we all have a responsibility to get accurate information, to report things to people, to share things with people at dinner tables, breaking bread, drinking wine, doing our things, online, chatting, etc., teaching, etc., doing films. There are many different ways that we can do this, but I think we all need to be doing it. And I think our culture tends from the 50s forward, and the consensus culture was that there's a class of experts and that we should just listen to them. And they're right, and everybody else is wrong. You know, that hasn't gotten us very far. And I think that if we maybe look at what that has to offer and what some of the good parts of that are and temper it with a lot of this other democratic dialogue, I think then we may have a real model for a people's journalism. And I think maybe we may really grow through an adolescent period where we are then able to be our true, responsible, self-governing people.
Do you think that everything will be all right?
Everything will be all right, meaning I think whenever, again, we stop outsourcing our agency to these institutions and experts and so forth. And I mean, I'm speaking of myself. I don't think people should look at me as an expert. You know, I see what I do more as a facilitator, a conduit. Someone that is part of the flow of information and it comes through me. I don't own this information. Information is part of the commons and part of the heritage of human history that we owe it to each other to share. That is where we get our concepts of liberty and ability to take these things. Take in that regard, right? Take because we begin to understand that they are already there. They don't need to be taken, they need to be understood and realized, and then integrated into us in ways that are holistic and responsible for those around us, not just for our own gain and purpose. And you know, it's interesting, an article that Lewis Lapham wrote in Harper's on history and the way we look at history, you know, it reminded me of this as someone that teaches history. It was that you know, every generation has this end of time sort of thread in it somewhere, right? The eve of destruction and nuclear holocaust, the end of the Mayan calendar. You know, and the time between World War I and II. I mean, my God, talk about apocalyptic scenarios and the advent of industrial warfare and the atomic age, right? So in some regard, I think it's hyperbolic and somewhat culturally or generationally egotistical or narcissistic. Because if you go back and look, each generation kind of feels like they're on the brink. I think that's good if it's a motivator, right? To do something better. Back to the native and indigenous cultures of the Americas, what are we leaving behind? Are we building towards a more conscious society? Are we building toward a more informed network of people on the planet? You know, and you know, this doesn't have to. This immediately gets labeled, like we were talking about labels before. As soon as you start to talk about that, then you're holistic or you're the. You know, there's got to be a label for it, and it's like, look, forget about the labels and just think about the ideas. And really become those ideas. And I think part of the role of the free press and the media is to help people achieve a sense of awareness and consciousness where they become responsible actors and they become responsible reporters sharing information. So the idea of everything will be all right, I think everything will be all right when everybody has access to the things that they need in their daily survival. I'm not talking about Xboxes and iPad 3s. I'm talking about sustainable communities, caring relationships, sustainable, healthy food and air and water. And again, that kind of stuff gets labeled as hippy-dippy talk. That's just a way to get people consuming more crap.
Yeah.
More crap culture, crass consumer behavior that is not filling the emptiness that has been generated by industrial society.
Yeah.
And because the news media has been co-opted and owned by these private for-profit businesses, in many cases, they have lost the original intent of a free press.
Absolutely.
And I think even beyond that, beyond the American conception of First Amendment free press rights, I think we've just really lost the ability to understand the commons and the promises of what past culture and past generations have really left for us. And of course, they've left messes.
Yeah.
And we will leave messes. But depending on where you look, things can be all right if we also take the positive messages and take the proactive things, and we don't reinvent those wheels, we build on them.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that that's something also, the messages of hope, not faux elixirs of hope and change that are packaged as soundbite campaign slogans, but really working toward things, because that's an incredible manipulation of the human spirit.
Yeah.
Because if you can say anything about many of the negative things about human history, there's one other thing that you can say that seems to outshine all of the negativity, is the quest for survival and the hope that things will be all right. And I think that if we really hold that at the center of how we act in our daily lives, and we try to use that as a mechanism to become more informed and aware, and we're able to share that through our networks of media, I think that is something that gives us hope and gives us a platform from where to build a better tomorrow.
With so many options for news sources, it's important that those sources be factual and unbiased. Very few outlets today can claim to be that, which is why it's more important than ever that all of us research the important topics and come to an understanding of what the truth is together. If we don't, I believe we'll be led further and further away from building a better world.